Until that day, my life felt stable, rooted in a routine that I had built over years of dedication and hard work. I had a decent job, a family I cherished, and a quiet pride in the life I had created. Everything seemed secure. My days revolved around my wife, Marcy, and our 2 boys. The world I woke up to each morning felt familiar, comfortable. Looking back now, though, maybe that stability made me a bit naive. It convinced me that what I relied on was unshakable, that it would never change. But life, as I'd soon discover, has a way of surprising you, even when you think you've got it all figured out. This realization didn't come gradually. It hit me in a single, unforgettable moment that turned my entire world upside down. It might sound like something out of a cliché, but it was real and it happened to me. I wish I could tell this story in a way that sounds more poetic or dramatic, but there's no sugarcoating it. Finding out about my wife's affair felt like living out one of those overused lines you hear in movies. As for my job, I work at an auto parts plant, handling brake pads, a job that's necessary though often thankless. Fate had a way of playing its part that night. From 4 to midnight, 5 days a week, I work one of the oldest machines in the plant. I wear safety goggles, earplugs, steel-toed boots, and a denim apron. I hit my quotas every day, and if I'm lucky, I get a year-end bonus. I live in a modest, comfortable house with 3 bedrooms, a loving wife, and 2 boys in elementary school. After 12 years of marriage, everything seemed fine. Until today. At work, we have 5 stations where we assemble brake pads, all running on compressed air. For the past 8 years, there had been no issues with the equipment. But today, halfway through the shift, the air system failed. The air that powers the machines has to be perfectly dry, filtered and dehumidified by equipment that almost never malfunctions. But tonight, the dehumidifier couldn't release the moisture it had collected. I'm no expert, but I know that moisture combined with high-pressure air causes freezing, and when that happens, everything stops. Instead of waiting around, they sent the entire team home, without pay, of course. You could say my life started unraveling because of that trapped moisture. When I opened our bedroom door later, I found something that hit harder than anything I could have imagined. A large, hairy back moving up and down on my wife, Marcy. Without thinking, I flipped on the light. Marcy was wide awake. "Damn it, Danny. What are you doing here?" she snapped. I expected fear, regret, maybe some embarrassment, but all I got was anger. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. "Oh, don't act like an idiot," she retorted. "You know exactly what's going on." She wasn't sorry, and there was no shame. "I'm sorry you had to see this, but if you'd come home on time, this wouldn't have happened." The guy, who was lying on top of her, looked up and smirked. Marcy quickly pulled up the blanket, trying to hide herself. My big mistake was grabbing the guy when he tried to get out of bed. He was much bigger standing up than lying down. My reward? 2 hard punches to the ribs. I didn't get a chance to land a punch myself and ended up on the floor, gasping for air. It was around that moment that he hit me in the head, and everything went dark. Later, at the ER, a technician was bandaging my ribs while Marcy sat nearby, looking disgusted. After the tech left, I turned to her, my voice shaking with anger. "Marcy, who the hell is this guy, and what was he doing in our house?" I demanded. "His name's Tony," she replied, almost calmly. "He's my friend. I invited him." "You slept with him? In our bed with our kids just down the hall?" I asked, barely able to process the words as they came out. "Yeah," she said, unfazed, as if this was just another ordinary day. "And if you hadn't made such a scene, they'd still be asleep. I had to call my sister to watch them just to bring you here." "What was he doing there?" Pressed. She rolled her eyes. "How many times are you going to ask that?" We had Zach over, fooled around. What's so hard to understand about that? I could barely hold it together, my heart pounding in my chest. Is this a one-time thing, or is this regular? She hesitated for a moment, then admitted, "Tony and I have been seeing each other for about 6 months. We tried to keep it from you. We usually don't come to the house, but I couldn't find a sitter today." I struggled to keep my voice even. "Is it over now?" No, Danny, she replied, blunt as ever. This isn't ending. You're a good dad and a decent husband, but Tony's great in bed. There's no reason to stop just because you know now. We just won't meet here again. It's unfair to you and the kids. I stared at her, completely stunned. Marcy, this is unacceptable. We're done. If you try to break this off, you'll regret it, she warned, her tone cold. Tony can knock you out without breaking a sweat, and he'll do it again. If you act up, everyone will know your wife's with another man, and you're too weak to do anything about it. Friends, neighbors, they'll know first. I'll make sure your family knows what a loser you are. Your coworkers will see you as the betrayed guy. Think about it, Danny. Hell, even your sons might hate you. Do you want that? Do you want to look like a fool and humiliate me? I'll make sure that happens. Tony thinks you're a wimp, and honestly, so do I. You'll have to live with it. I could barely contain my anger. Who is this guy? Where does he work? He doesn't work, Marcy said with a touch of condescension. He owns Continental Classics, the luxury car dealership on Lancaster Pike. You know, the one you've always wanted to check out but never got around to? He's richer, smarter, and better in bed than you. And apparently he's stronger too. Why don't you just marry him? Then, if he's so perfect? I shot back, my frustration boiling over. She smiled coolly, almost amused. That's why I keep you around, honey. Tony doesn't like kids, and I'm not giving mine up for him. So, you get to play the dad while Tony gets the romance. And I'm just supposed to go along with all this? I asked, incredulity creeping into my voice. Her expression hardened, her eyes cold. You don't have a choice. You can either accept it, or everyone will know what a pathetic loser you are. She stood up, ready to leave. By the way, I'm moving your stuff to the guest room. Now that the secret's out, there's no reason for us to share a bed anymore. As she got up, part of me felt a strange sense of relief, but curiosity gnawed at me. So, who watched the kids while you were out with Tony? Karen usually did, she said casually. Sometimes I'd drop them off at your parents'. By the way, it was Karen who introduced me to Tony. I made a mental note to thank Karen later. As Marcy left the room, I was discharged from the hospital the next morning, but Marcy was nowhere to be found. At that point, I had a decision to make. Call someone for a ride or take a taxi. I chose the taxi. The kids were at school and Marcy was out. When I got home, I found my clothes and personal belongings stacked on the guest bed. I figured Todd and Terry would have questions about all this, so I decided to let Marcy explain it to them. It took less than an hour for me to settle into my new space, though my mind was racing. There was no way I was going to let this end the way Marcy had planned. My first move? I headed to the basement to dig out my old phone recorder. It only worked with a landline, but I had no other options. Marcy usually called on her cell, but it only took 20 minutes to set up and hide the recorder behind some paint cans. Step 1 was done. I felt terrible, but I was ready to get back to work. Instead of taking the strong painkillers they'd given me, I took some Tylenol. I didn't want to be medicated while operating the machine. Marcy had seriously misjudged me. The level of support I got from the guys at work was something else. I told them everything that went down the night before, and they all jumped in with ideas, some useful, others completely absurd. But it felt good to know they had my back. We started our 8-hour shift, each of us brainstorming ways to make things right. By dinner break, we were deep into planning. All right, anyone got a solid idea? I asked. Glenn kicked things off. Not really, but I do have a cousin who works for that idiot, he said. He does detailing on the cars. From what he's told me, he hates DeMarco. He could probably give us the inside scoop on the place, business details, layout, shifts. That'll help. Good one, Glenn. Anyone else? I looked around the room. Danny jumped in. I've got 2 rifles and 2 pistols. I could lend you one of each. They're all unregistered, so nothing to worry about. Thanks, Danny, but that's a bit more drastic than I'm aiming for, I replied. Well, then you probably won't want to hear my idea, Freddie said, grinning. Go on, Freddie. Spill it. Freddie leaned forward, clearly excited. I say we tie him to a tree, legs spread, and light a fire right between his legs. Indian style. Everyone burst out laughing at Freddy's wild idea, but we all knew it was a no-go. Kyle, who had been quiet up until then, suddenly had all eyes on him. "What?" he said defensively. "Stop staring at me like that. You got any ideas?" I asked him. "Yeah, but it's kind of weird," he replied, shifting uncomfortably. "I read about this prison in Arizona where they made guys wear pink jumpsuits. Must have been humiliating. I know Tony's not a prisoner, but something like that could embarrass the hell out of him." "You mean dress him in a pink tracksuit?" I asked. "Couldn't he just take it off?" Kyle thought for a moment. "What if we sprayed him down with pink paint? That'd really make a statement. Then he'd know who did it. We'd have to knock him out first and leave him tied up until someone finds him," I pointed out. "How do we do that?" Kyle shrugged. "Pills or knock him out cold. I could get a taser. Just sneak up and zap him." "Easier said than done," I muttered. "How do we get close enough without him noticing?" "I don't know, but it's an idea," Kyle said with a sigh. The buzzer sounded, signaling the end of our break. We still had 4 hours left on the shift, and since my quota was low, the guys helped cover for me. When I got home, Marcy was already asleep. At least she had kept her word about not bringing that clown into our house. But I still didn't have a real plan. Most of the guys' suggestions felt like high school pranks. I might as well leave a flaming bag of dog poop on his porch. I needed something serious. By the time I woke up the next day, it was noon. The kids were at school, and I could hear Marcy moving around the house. I quickly showered, shaved, and headed out. "Good morning, husband. No kiss for your wife?" she said, standing at the kitchen sink, hand on her hip, smirking. I turned and walked out without replying. Her sarcasm didn't deserve a response. I needed breakfast and some time to myself. The rest of the day was just a blur. Passing the time, trying to figure out how to deal with my wife's lover without causing a scene. I needed to finish my shift tonight and start planning. I decided I wouldn't eat at home anymore. It was the only real time I had with the kids, but I couldn't stomach Marcy's cooking. Soon it was time to head to work. Everything went smoothly until dinner break, when Danny leaned over and said, "I've got a taser in my car. Not sure if you can use it for anything, but at least you'd have it for self-defense." Kyle grinned, clearly pleased with himself. "Don't forget to pick it up before you head home." "Have you ever even used that thing?" someone asked. Kyle smirked. "We can test it out. Any volunteers?" The only response was a chorus of groans around the table. No one had new ideas, but everyone was on board to support whatever I decided to do next. It was comforting to know I had friends I could rely on. When I got home, the house was quiet. It was going to be a short night for me. Working the night shift messes with your sleep schedule, especially on weekends. I ended up waking up earlier than usual. Todd and Terry were pumped for a day at Chuck E. Cheese, and Marcy didn't seem to mind when I told her we'd be out all day. But then she dropped the bombshell. "Danny, I need you to take a few days off next week. Tony's friend Wally is coming down from Detroit, and we're taking a 4-day cruise to Cancun. If you can't swing it, maybe your parents could watch the kids," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Let me get this straight. You're going on a cruise with 2 guys? Even for you, that sounds pretty outrageous." She shot back, "Don't be rude, Danny. It doesn't suit you. Wal's rooming with Karen. They've been friends for years." "Oh, in that case, I guess it's perfectly fine," I replied sarcastically, already planning to thank Karen later. I had started the day a little too early to kill time, so we hit the hobby shop next to our house before Chuck E. Cheese opened. The boys were old enough to handle most of the plastic model kits on display. Their finished creations weren't masterpieces, but they enjoyed the process. I left them to explore the shelves and wandered around, amused by the endless craft supplies for the creative types. If Marcy had been into crafts, maybe she wouldn't have brought home that hairy ape. But it was too late for what-ifs. My eyes lit up when I saw rows of designer spray paints, including 6 cans of pink. The selection wasn't as big as Lowe's or Home Depot, but it was pink, the only place I'd ever seen that color in a can. Taking it as a sign, I grabbed all 6 cans. Todd picked out a monster truck kit and Terry went with a tow truck. Yeah, they even made those. Before we left, I grabbed a pack of 10 large plastic cable ties, about 18 inches long. They looked perfect for what I had in mind. By then, Chuck E. Cheese was open. The kids spent about 4 hours and 2 pizzas worth of energy before finally calling it quits. We stopped by Pandora Park with some cheap bread for the ducks, who devoured it in about 10 minutes. We stayed a couple of hours longer before heading to my parents' for dinner. Todd and Terry spent the evening watching TV, while I pulled Dad aside to explain Marcy's situation. I realized I was telling people before she had the chance, which kind of made her threats meaningless. Dad assured me they'd support the kids no matter what happened, which made my plans easier. I didn't want the kids caught up in all this drama. Around 9 o'clock, I called Marcy to let her know we'd be staying at my parents' for the night. After breakfast at IHOP the next morning, we returned to find her still in bed. I immediately fired up the lawnmower, making sure she'd hear it as I passed the bedrooms. Todd and Terry couldn't wait to start their model kits, and though it was a beautiful day, I let them go ahead. I spent the day doing yard work, edging and trimming, but progress was slow because I kept stopping to chat with the neighbors. I borrowed hedge trimmers from Mike Fielding across the street. His wife, Mary, was one of the neighborhood's biggest gossips, so I told Mike there might be strange cars around because Marcy would have her male friends over. I reassured him it would be fine unless they got drunk and loud. In that case, I told him to call the cops. I'd have a hard time controlling things since I worked nights. Larry Finley, a church board member, lent me a spark plug wrench, and I apologized for Marcy's recent behavior. Naturally, he wanted details, and within 10 minutes, he had more than enough gossip to last him a month. I skipped lunch and wrapped things up around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. After a quick shower, I treated myself to the most expensive meal at Rosie's Cantina. I'm not sure if it was worth the price, but it sure was delicious. I spent the rest of the evening. With my brother Dave and his family, who were already in the loop about what was going on, thanks to Dad. I crashed on his couch for the night. Marcy thought she could control me by threatening to humiliate me as the betrayed husband, trying to force me into supporting her affair. She figured she could make my life miserable. It was a clever move, but ultimately flawed. In less than a week, I'd already spilled the beans to everyone, which neutralized her threat. It actually made her seem more approachable to people than she'd planned. I don't think she ever expected me to react this way. The next day, I arrived home to change for work, only to find Marcy waiting for me. Furious. "What did you tell the neighbors?" she demanded. "Karen says you're going around telling people I run a brothel here at night." "Come on, Marcy," I replied, trying to calm the situation down. "That's not what I said. I just mentioned you might have mail company when I'm working, so they shouldn't worry about it." "Well, that's not how it sounded to them." "Who else did you talk to?" she pressed. "Everyone," I admitted. "I figured it would be easier to reach them before you did. But don't worry, I haven't mentioned anything to your parents or sisters. You might want to get to them before the rumors do." "Damn it, Danny. You're making me look like a cheater." "Well, that's only fair, considering you were trying to make me look like a betrayed man." I glanced at my watch. "Sorry, dear, but I need to get to work." The hardest part for me was missing quality time with the kids. But Glenn gave me the best news of the night. Continental Classics closed at 9 o'clock on Thursdays, so Tony could handle payroll alone without interruptions. Not even the cleaning staff would be there. Kyle showed me how to use the taser, though no one had volunteered to test it yet. The plan was in place. I fully expected to get caught, maybe even face jail time, but it didn't matter. Tony DeMarco needed to be humiliated. And if I got arrested, I'd make sure every news outlet knew the full story. That kind of publicity would wreck him, or at least make him angry enough to mess up in the coming days. I only went home to sleep, shower, and change. I didn't eat at home anymore after that first day. Finally, Thursday arrived. I arranged for my truck to break down so Kyle could give me a ride. The floor supervisor didn't bother us as long as we kept up a steady pace, met our quotas, and produced quality work. With the gloves, aprons, and welding goggles we all wore, OSHA regulations ensured we all looked the same on the line. At 8:30, I slipped out the back. The guys took turns running my machine to keep up appearances. Bathroom breaks were frequent and rarely monitored, so no one would question my absence. I entered Continental Classics through the service door and went straight to the restroom. Just after 9 o'clock, I checked the lights, put on latex gloves, and snuck into the dimly lit office. Tony's desk faced the showroom with his back to the door. It seemed easier than I'd anticipated. He was focused on an old adding machine, pounding away at the paper tape, oblivious to my approach. I shot Tony in the back of the head with the taser. His body jerked, and he almost turned around, so I shocked him again. This time he twitched a few times, then went limp. Perfect. I secured his legs and arms with 2 plastic ties each, then used an old tie as a blindfold. He was surprisingly pliable. I wheeled his chair up to the glass partition by the showroom, where everyone would see him first thing in the morning. The pink paint looked great, though I had to use a lot more than I'd expected. It soaked into his clothes quickly, so it took 3 coats on each spot to get the look I wanted. I barely had enough paint, but I finished it. He looked quite striking in pink. Once I was done, I packed up carefully. I expected him to wake up at some point, but he remained still. I'd planned to remove the blindfold before leaving, but when I checked my watch, Tony hadn't moved. I waited for 5 minutes, but still nothing. Panic started creeping in. I couldn't find his pulse with the latex gloves on, so I carefully removed one and pressed my fingers to his neck. Still nothing. I felt a wave of dread. I peeled off the blindfold and poked his eye gently with a pencil, looking for a reflex. Again, nothing. My heart started to race. I quickly slapped the glove back on and wiped down every surface I'd touched. I pocketed the tie and cut through the plastic ties that held him in place. The indents from the ties on his skin made him look almost cartoonish, like a raccoon. I did one last sweep of the room to make sure I hadn't missed anything, then slipped out trying to stay calm. As I made my way back, I dropped everything, including the taser, into a storm drain. 10 minutes later, I was back on the assembly line, blending in with the team, assembling brake pads without a hitch. The shift came to a close, and I pulled the guys aside to fill them in. They'd been involved too, so I trusted them to keep quiet. Freddie looked genuinely impressed, and no one seemed rattled by the events. Kyle drove me home, and we made a mental note of the exact drop-off time. I barely slept. At around 10 o'clock, Marcy burst into my room, her face twisted in anger. "What did you do? What the hell have you done, you idiot?" she spat, towering over me. I sat up slowly, genuinely confused. "What are you talking about? Tony's dead," she snapped, her voice trembling with fury. "Karen called me. They found him this morning in his office. I know you're involved, and I'll make sure you pay for this." It was the second time she'd called me an idiot in a matter of minutes, and it was becoming clear that I wasn't going to be getting any sleep. I swung my legs off the bed and got up, not eager to face her outburst. I decided to drag my feet a bit. I took a long shower, shaved slowly, even splashed on aftershave. Anything to irk her more. When I finally stepped out, I noticed a tall man in a dark suit with close-cropped hair in the living room. He was talking to Marcy in hushed tones. It was clear she'd already contacted the authorities. I shook my head and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a cup of coffee. I caught Marcy's smug look as I sat down, her expression hardly concealing her satisfaction at what was unfolding. The man stood up and turned to face me. "Mr. Mercer, I'm Detective Darnell Green," he said with formality. "I'm here to discuss the passing of Anthony DeMarco. Your wife mentioned a recent disagreement between you two, and I'd like to ask you a few questions." "Of course, Detective," I replied calmly. "But I'd rather not do this here." He raised an eyebrow. "What do you propose?" "If we're going to have this conversation, let's do it in your office," I said, trying to keep the situation under control. "Not in my home. Does that sound all right?" I glanced at Marcy, and she shot me an irritated look. She clearly thought she would be part of this conversation. "Your car or mine?" I asked. "I have an errand to run first." "I'll meet you there," I added, glancing at Marcy again with a slight smile. "Room 206 on the second floor, just off the elevator. Marcy's expression darkened as I grabbed my shoes. I left the coffee half finished in the sink, gave her a final glance and said, "Looks like you'll get what you wanted, dear." "Are you talking about Danny?" she asked suspiciously, narrowing her eyes. "What does that mean?" she pressed. I made my way to the municipal building and met Detective Green in room 206. For the next hour, he asked the right questions and I gave the right answers. He kept it professional, never pushing too hard, and I respected that. I admitted there had been tension between Tony and me, but I made it clear that I'd never had the opportunity to act on it. The conversation was serious but cordial, and I kept things friendly, not smug. To my surprise, Detective Green revealed that Tony had died of a heart condition. Apparently, the pacemaker he'd had installed a few years ago had malfunctioned when hit with the taser. They had found marks on his neck that confirmed it. Part of me felt some regret, but mostly I was relieved. At least there wouldn't be any immediate consequences. Detective Green ended our meeting with the usual, "Don't leave town" warning and mentioned he'd check my alibi before following up. I had never thought I'd need an alibi before. It was strange but almost thrilling. We parted ways on good terms, and for a moment, I felt like Detective Green was actually on my side. The thought of things finally falling into place filled me with a sense of warmth. I grabbed some food and settled in front of the TV, where the news was reporting the passing of a local businessman. They mentioned how he had no known family, which, to me, was just one more reminder that everything could be disposed of without a trace. After a leisurely breakfast, I emptied my bank accounts and made sure everything was in order. When I got home, the house was quiet. Marcy was gone. It only took me about half an hour to move all my things back into the master bedroom. I then transferred her belongings into the guest room. The small closet and chest of drawers were more than enough to fit her things. I laid everything out on the bed for her to sort through when she came back. I checked the phone in the basement, but there was nothing of interest. I gathered all the important documents, bank records, insurance papers, anything valuable, and felt a weight lift off my shoulders when I realized the Volvo Marcy drove was still in my name. I tucked all the paperwork into a folder and placed it under the front seat of my truck. Then I called work and requested 2 weeks off. A few hours later, Marcy returned, clearly surprised and confused to find me at home. She stormed in, demanding answers. I smiled, unfazed, and calmly led her to the guest room. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice filled with disbelief. "Who do you think you are?" I grinned wider than I probably should have. "Here's the deal, Marcy. From now on, I'll be staying in the master bedroom, and you'll be in the guest room. I suggest you start putting your things away. Anything left out by dinner will be removed. Any questions?" She crossed her arms, glaring at me. "I can't fit all my stuff in this tiny closet. And I'm not staying here anyway," she snapped. "If you can't fit it, you don't need it," I said, not breaking a sweat. "That's not happening, Danny," she said defiantly. "Whatever game you're playing, it won't work. You're dead meat." I remained calm. "Start organizing your things. I'll be back later if you have more questions." "You're a fool," she muttered under her breath. With Marcy distracted, I moved to the kitchen and began rummaging through her purse. I was careful as I selected what I wanted. Her phone, her car keys, her driver's license, and all her credit and debit cards. I left the rest behind, grabbing the car papers from my truck as I went. Then I drove her Volvo to a friend's used car lot on the other side of town. I sold it for a decent price, with the stipulation that it would be resold outside the city. After paying off the remaining balance, I still had a few thousand left in my pocket. I was about to head to Taco Bell for lunch when my cell phone rang. I looked at the screen, expecting it to be work. Instead, it was Marcy, and her voice was seething with fury. "You idiot!" she screamed. "Where's my car? What did you do with my phone?" I couldn't help but feel pleased that she didn't call me a fool this time. She was calling from the house phone, which was promising. I put on my best apologetic tone. "I'm sorry, honey," I said, dragging out my words. "I needed some cash to hire a lawyer, for those liquidation charges. I promise I'll get you a new car as soon as I get out of prison." I could hear her screaming at me from the other end of the line as I hung up. I turned my phone off, the conversation still ringing in my ears. I knew I needed a lawyer, but staying married was out of the question. That could wait. I arrived at Taco Bell and ordered my lunch, still processing the events. After eating, I headed home. Todd and Terry were there when I walked in, eager to show me the models they'd built. I ignored Marcy for the most part, exchanging only a few glances. She didn't look too happy. After a while, Marcy called the boys to wash up for dinner, and I went to gather my things from the guest room. To my surprise, her clothes had been moved back into the master bedroom, while mine remained in the guest room. I chuckled, but I didn't argue. She seemed set on her decisions. When dinner came around, I didn't think twice about it. I made a reservation at Red Lobster. Money wasn't an issue anymore. I had enough cash left, even after paying the retainer for the divorce lawyer. Dinner was good, especially the cheese buns. Just as I was finishing up, my phone rang again. I hoped it was work or maybe Detective Green. Instead, it was Marcy, sounding more irritated than ever. Danny, how am I supposed to get to the store for groceries? We need milk and a few other things. I'll take you when I get home, I said, keeping my tone level. But maybe you should plan these trips for Saturdays when I'm not working. I'll feel better if you don't go alone, I added quickly, cutting her off before she could argue. Before she could respond, I said, "They're calling me again. We'll talk later." I hung up, and just as I'd expected, my second call was from Kyle. Detective Green had finished interviewing everyone, both individually and as a group. All the stories checked out, and even Tom Tingle, the floor manager, had backed me up. "There's no way you could have left early," he'd said. "Tom kept us all under close watch." I nodded, knowing I had the perfect alibi. I knew they'd be up all night trying to figure out a way to prove I had liquidated Tony DeMarco. But no one seemed to be making any moves in that direction. By the time I got home, it was just in time to tuck the boys in. Marcy was on the couch, nursing a glass of wine. I grabbed a cold Foster's from the fridge and sat down in front of the TV. But with the screen off, it felt like the right moment to talk. "So, Marcy," I started, "how's the plan to turn me into a joke going?" That shut everything down pretty quickly. She drained her glass, stood up, and walked to her room without saying a word. I called after her. "I thought you wanted to talk?" But she didn't answer, disappearing into the dark of the hallway. I sighed, took a long swig of my beer, and checked the answering machine. The first message was from Marcy's sister, Marge, who clearly knew about the affair with Tony and had no problem supporting her. That was useful information. The second message was from her mom, who had no clue about anything. Marcy had spun her usual story, calling Tony a friend of Karen's, and claiming I was just being jealous. She even went so far as to say Tony had scolded me for it. The audacity of it made me livid. Though she didn't outright say it, it sounded like Marcy was trying to plant the idea that I'd eliminated Tony. Her mom, bless her heart, seemed to catch on. Marcy had also called the cell phone company, but couldn't replace the phone I took. She had reported her driver's license as stolen to the DMV, which advised her to contact the police. She also tried getting a new credit card, only to find her account had been closed. Busy day for her, I thought with a smirk. The last message was from Karen, who lived just a few houses down. They didn't meet up, which worked in my favor. From their conversation, I picked up two important things. Wally was still coming from Detroit, and Marcy planned to lay low until he got here. The next morning, the boys and I left the house early, well before Marcy had even woken up. We came back around lunchtime, and Marcy immediately demanded I take her to the grocery store since she had no car or license. Later, as she prepared dinner, I checked the recorder. Wally had arrived and immediately called Marcy. Their conversation was heated. Wally, being Tony's childhood friend, believed every word Marcy told him and wanted revenge for his friend's death. He gave her his address, asking her to call him the next day. Marcy was practically glowing as she shared the news with Karen. She sounded like a completely different person. It was as if eliminating Tony had turned me into the villain in her eyes. I couldn't believe how quickly things had shifted. That evening, I decided to grab some food outside, putting off dealing with Marcy for a little while. The lawn needed mowing again, which was a perfect excuse to stay out of her way. Around 11 that night, Marcy's parents showed up to take the boys for a sleepover. They hadn't told me in advance, but Grandma Wilcox assured me they'd have the boys back in time for school. I didn't argue. I was more than happy to get some peace and quiet. Eager to check my phone records, I decided to grab some lunch first. After a quick shower, I went to see Dennis while Marcy stayed quiet about me not eating at home. I had learned that Marcy and Wally had come up with a plan to avenge Tony's death. If I hadn't already figured out what they were up to, their scheme would have almost been laughable. The plan was for Wally to sneak into the house through the unlocked sliding door. They were going to stage it to look like a robbery gone wrong where I'd end up shot. Marcy and Karen were supposed to call 911 if they heard gunshots. The irony hit me then. I hadn't updated my life insurance beneficiaries. After giving Marcy a sarcastic kiss goodbye and getting a rude gesture in return, I spent the evening at my parents' house, borrowing my dad's short-barrel snake charmer rifle. It was the perfect weapon for what I had in mind. When I got back, Marcy was already in bed with the light on, apparently reading. The answering machine was filled with Karen's voice, bragging about her day with Wally and promising Marcy everything would be set up for that night. I spent about 20 minutes swapping out the rifle shells with rock salt instead of buckshot. I had a bag left over from last winter, and I didn't want to eliminate Wally. I just needed to stop him. After I'd finished, I settled into my chair, keeping my cell phone nearby. I waited. Just after midnight, I saw Wally on the deck. I dialed 911, reporting an intruder and telling them I feared for my life. I left the line open and waited. Wally slid open the patio door and stepped inside. Once he was all the way in, I fired, aiming low. The shot sent him crashing back out onto the terrace. A second shot hit him and he fell off the deck, breaking the railing in the process. His screams told me he was still alive, though the rock salt had definitely done its job. The noise of the shots was deafening inside the house, and my ears were ringing. I turned on the lights, and Marcy came rushing into the room, yelling incoherently. I ignored her, checking on Wally. He was lying on the ground, his ankle clearly broken from the fall. I walked over to him and saw the silenced Ruger on the ground next to him. Marcy was still screaming until I pointed the rifle at her. She immediately bolted from the room, her panic giving her speed. Wally had gotten lucky. He was alive but definitely hurt. About 10 minutes later, a police car pulled up. I carefully placed the rifle on the floor to avoid any misunderstandings and pointed to the phone. One of the officers informed the emergency operator that everything was under control. They asked who else was in the house. When we got back to the house, I told the officers that Marcy was in the bedroom. They brought her out, but she let loose a string of curses that none of us could manage to silence. Finally, a large female officer grabbed her by the hand and led her outside. I caught sight of Karen with the neighbors and gave her a sarcastic gesture. She immediately turned away, which somehow lifted my spirits. The ambulance arrived to pick up Wally just as Detective Green showed up. We exchanged smiles, and I couldn't help but grin back at him. The big officer brought Marcy back inside to get dressed. After she calmed down a little, we were ready to head to the police station. I insisted on taking separate cars, and Detective Green let me ride with him. We didn't speak much during the drive, but Green shot me a look that said he knew something I didn't. At the station, we had a quick talk. Before I knew it, he was releasing me just as the sun began to rise. They'd kept me up all night, forcing endless cups of coffee into me. A patrol car dropped me off at home, and I was surprised to see there was no crime scene tape. Nothing to suggest that anything had happened. The rock salt hadn't even cracked the glass door. Felt like it had all been a dream. Exhausted, I went straight to bed and didn't wake up until the afternoon. Heading into the kitchen, I was shocked to find Detective Green already sitting there, reading the paper and sipping coffee. It looked like he'd made it himself. I poured myself a glass of orange juice and sat across from him, still wondering how he got in. "You're a tough guy, Mr. Mercer," he said without looking up from his paper. I stayed silent, unsure if he was being serious or joking. After a moment, I excused myself to take a shower, shave, and grab a bite to eat. "Take your time, Danny," he called after me. "I've got all day." I made 2 hefty sandwiches with pork and returned to find Green still there, silently sipping a beer. We ate in silence until he finally spoke. "Got questions, don't you, Mr. Mercer?" he asked, glancing at me. "I'd say the same about you," I replied. He signaled for the waiter and ordered another round of beers. "We've been questioning you all night," he said. "Now it's your turn." "Fine," I said, leaning back. "First off, where's my wife?" "She's still in custody. She'll be arraigned this afternoon." That caught me off guard. "Did her parents get her a lawyer?" I asked, careful not to reveal too much. But his answer only raised more questions. "Good to know her family's there for her," I said, keeping my voice even. "Because I won't be." He didn't seem bothered by my response. "Is there anything else you'd like to share?" he asked. I tilted my head. "Go ahead. I'm listening." He chuckled, took a long sip, then looked at me, his eyes sharp. "One more thing," he said. "Ever record your wife's chats with Mr. Williams?" "You mean Wally? If you had a tape like that," Green continued, "would you want it?" "Would you?" I shot back. "It could help." He gave me a nod. "Though with a strong enough lawyer, maybe it wouldn't." I raised an eyebrow. "And would having that tape backfire on me?" I asked, weighing his angle. Green smiled slightly. "Smart to think of that. I'm just trying to make my job easier." I gave a small nod. "I'll see what I can do without a tape." He set his glass down, locking eyes with me. "Danny, it's time to take you home. Your boys need their dad." We arrived just as the bus dropped off Todd and Terry. They were eager to meet my detective friend and asked to see his badge. Green played along, asking, "So, who built the tugboat and who built the monster truck?" "I built the truck," Todd said proudly. "I made the tug," Terry offered. "Want to see it?" "Maybe next time," Green said with a smile as he walked toward his car. As he left, it hit me. He knew more than he let on, especially about the pink paint. He had me exactly where he wanted me, and there was nothing I could do to change it. That evening, we ordered pizza. The boys didn't ask about their mom. After dinner, Marcy's father called, asking for help posting her bail. I politely declined, sensing he didn't fully understand what had happened but was trying to be supportive. I asked where Marcy would stay, and he said she'd stay with them. So, the boys and I packed up her things and drove them to her parents' house without issue. Back at home, I noticed a U-Haul at Karen's place. It was gone the next morning. Marcy never called. I relied on the newspaper for updates. Apparently, there would be no trial. Marcy blamed Wally for everything, and he claimed it was her idea. In the end, they both pled for leniency. Marcy got 3 to 5 years for conspiracy, while Wally got 5 to 10 years for attempted liquidation. Federal agents investigated the silencer Wally had used but decided to hold off on further action. Detective Green never mentioned the tape again. As for Karen, she vanished without a trace. My father chuckled when I handed back his rifle, offering it again if I ever needed it. I served Marcy with divorce papers as soon as she began her sentence. She didn't contest it. Since that night, I hadn't seen or heard from her. I sold the house and moved back in with my parents, who helped me take care of the boys since I couldn't juggle work and parenting on my own. My coworkers welcomed me back, even offering me a day shift, but I turned it down. Every month, I took the boys to visit their mother at the women's prison. I waited in the car while they went in. When the weather was nice, they met outside where I could watch them, but they never asked about her, nor did they talk about her much. This arrangement worked for all of us. Then I got a call. "Hello, is this Daniel Mercer?" A woman's voice asked. "Yes, this is Daniel," I replied. "This is Angela Hawkins. Detective Darnell Green suggested I contact you. We need to talk." "Why do you want to speak with me?" I asked. "Tony DeMarco was my brother," she said. "Perfect. Just when I thought everything had finally settled, it all came rushing back. I'm sorry for your loss, but I don't think I can help you," I said, and hung up before she could respond. 2 days later, she called again. "Daniel, could you meet me?" she asked. Detective Green told me you're reasonable, she continued. Where did you have in mind? I asked. I'd prefer a car dealership, but I'm flexible if there's somewhere more convenient for you. After a pause, I said, let's meet Saturday at 10 a.m. at the exhibition hall. I'll bring my sons. They enjoy looking at old cars. Not knowing her intentions, I figured meeting in public with the boys around would be safer. I wasn't using them as shields, but I doubted she'd try anything with them there. After all, she was Tony's sister, and I figured she'd be hot-blooded. Overthinking it, I decided I needed a beer. I called Detective Green to ask what was going on, but he just laughed and told me to relax and meet her. The Continental Classic was a large, impressive venue, with an active opening celebration. I hadn't anticipated how torn my boys would be, between admiring the cars and enjoying the free popcorn and sodas. Angela Hawkins was easy to spot. She walked towards me with a steady pace, her dark hair, dark eyes, and olive skin giving her an unmistakably Italian look. Barely 5 feet tall, her build contrasted with her tall brothers. My curiosity was piqued, but then I noticed her 10-year-old daughter, a miniature version of Angela. It was clear that Angela was using her daughter for protection, just as I was using my sons. We were both relying on our children for a sense of safety. As she approached, she extended her hand with a friendly smile. Daniel Mercer, I assume? She asked. I shook her hand, and it felt both polite and natural. I've always wanted to say that, like in the movie about Dr. Livingston, she added, her smile tinged with a hint of nervousness. The moment helped me relax. Before I could respond, she introduced her daughter. This is my daughter, Carla. Todd smiled politely and introduced himself, while Terry extended his hand with a grin. Carla, why don't you show the boys around while I talk to their dad? Angela suggested. Carla took Terry into the showroom, and Todd headed straight for the hot dog stand. I took that as a good sign. Angela then offered, we can talk here downstairs or upstairs in my office. The office sounds fine, I replied. As we walked up to her office, I noticed several employees glancing our way, making comments and giving me thumbs up. It made me feel a little self-conscious. Angela seemed to notice too, and offered me a reassuring smile. Did Detective Green fill you in on my situation? She asked. I shook my head. I won't bore you with my life story, she continued. But Tony was my only family, and without a will, I inherited his business. The lawyer took a big cut, but I still ended up with more than I expected. Glad someone gained something positive, I replied, noticing her wedding ring, pierced ears, and a small silver cross around her neck. I tried to focus on what she was saying, but my eyes kept drifting. Mr. Mercer, what are you looking at? She asked, her playful smile making me feel a bit embarrassed. I was admiring your crucifix, I replied, reminding myself to keep eye contact. She playfully tapped my hand. How about a beer? That sounds like a good idea, I said, and she reached into a small fridge by the table. As she bent over to grab some beers, I couldn't help but notice her figure. She handed me a beer, and we shared a moment of silence as we drank. Well, Miss Hawkins, I said, breaking the quiet. I'm glad things worked out for you, but I'm not sure why I'm here. I should get back to the boys. Call me Angela, she said, her tone shifting slightly. Can I call you Danny? Sure. But are we done here? No, she said, her expression turning serious. Just sit tight. Detective Green said you'd understand. I stayed silent, waiting to see what she would say next. Angela got straight to the point. Tony was a fool, a worthless idiot who deserved what he got. As strange as it sounded, I was almost expecting this. But then she said something that caught me off guard. I wanted to thank you. I froze. Was this some kind of setup? Was the room bugged? Or was she wearing a mic? I found myself glancing at her neckline again, trying to figure it out. Are you recording this? I asked, my voice low and cautious. No, she replied, a little surprised. Why would I do that? Still not fully convinced, I took another sip of my beer, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe I should go check on the boys, I suggested. Sit down, she said firmly, her tone leaving little room for argument. Tony and I weren't close, she began. 3 years ago, my husband died in an accident, and Tony was my family. I asked him for help, but all he did was cover a few funeral costs and then completely ignored me. So his passing worked out for you? I probed, trying to piece things together. Yes, she replied, nodding slightly. Maybe it's helped you too. We can just be grateful and leave it at that. Angela finished her beer and smiled faintly, but then her expression turned serious. I need your help. You're the only one who can do it. I leaned forward. What do you need? I want you to be the general manager here, she said, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. You're crazy. I don't know anything about luxury cars, I replied, shaking my head. I already have people who handle that, she said calmly, but there was something in her eyes that told me she had more to say. Then why me? I asked. Angela hesitated, glancing around before speaking again. Did you notice how my staff reacted when you walked in with me? She asked. Yeah, I saw, I replied. They didn't even smile. They think you liquidated Tony and they're terrified of you, almost respectful. Do you get what I'm saying? They don't respect you, I said slowly, beginning to understand. No, she corrected me, her voice tight. They're undermining me at every turn, and I can't stop it. So what could I do? I asked, genuinely curious. Just be here. With time, we'll both learn enough to control things. But until then, I need you to keep them in line, she said, her eyes locking onto mine with a level of intensity one hadn't expected. I'm a decent guy, Angela, I said, my voice a little strained. That's why Tony and my wife thought they could manipulate me. Angela relaxed a bit, her lips curling into a small smile. Didn't turn out so well for them, did it? Couldn't help but laugh at that. Over the next half hour, Angela and I went over the terms. She was more than willing to offer me a salary and benefits that far surpassed what I had at the factory. If things didn't work out, I could always return to my old job, but going back wasn't what I wanted. I wanted things to improve. Todd didn't look so well when we got downstairs. He'd eaten too many hot dogs and drank too much soda. Terry, on the other hand, was having a blast, chatting more with Carla than actually looking at the cars. This was definitely a good sign. On the way home, Todd got sick in the truck and missed dinner. By Monday, I started my new job. Everything went as Angela had said it would. I was surprised at how quickly I adapted. I made friends with several employees and began learning the operations. Glenn, who had greeted me with a big smile on my first day, turned out to be my biggest supporter. Most employees wanted the business to succeed and were happy to work without fuss. Angela let me start firearm training for security, and I found I enjoyed it. I was living up to my reputation. Detective Green stopped by for coffee now and then, mostly for light, friendly chats. Eventually, he shared a bit more about himself. 3 years ago, I was a cop in Philadelphia, he said one day, looking down at his coffee cup. I came home one day to find my wife in bed with my boss. I knocked him out right then and there and kicked my wife out. The department gave me a choice, quit or be fired. Within a week, I had a job here. But before I left, I made sure the guy who slept with my wife got fired too. I didn't ask for more details. It was his business, but I could see why he had my back. The boys agreed not to tell their mother about my new job during their visits. They occasionally commented on the long drive, but they seemed to understand that it wasn't optional. I felt it was important for Marcy to see her sons. Not for her sake, but as a reminder of what she had lost. I knew it was cruel to use my kids this way, but I couldn't deny the satisfaction. Angela and I began spending more time together, both at work and outside of it. One weekend, the boys insisted we take her and Carla to Noble Grove. Most of the time, we stayed close to home, and living arrangements made a romantic relationship difficult. I was interested in Angela, but it felt awkward. I was still living at my parents' house with the boys, and Angela and Carla shared a small one-room apartment. With things going better than expected, Angela started looking into buying a house. She spent a lot of time online, searching for the perfect place. One day, she called me to explain why she wanted a 4-bedroom home. Danny, I think it's important for each of the boys to have their own room. Better to handle this now than later. Don't you agree? Of course, I instantly recognized the question had more to it. It was clear that Angela saw me as more than just an employee. This romance had potential. Yes, that sounds good, I said. And maybe a split-bedroom plan would be wise. I'd rather the kids weren't too close to the master bedroom. After saying that, I left the office and noticed her smiling. Our relationship was unusual. We hadn't been physically engaged, not even kissed, but I felt closer to her than I had with Marcy in 12 years. 2 days later, when my divorce from Marcy was finalized, we celebrated at Red Lobster. The kids didn't know the real reason, but Angela did. Later, while the kids were engrossed in a pay-per-view movie, Angela pulled me aside into the kitchen, stood on her tiptoes, and kissed me. We were laughing and hugging when Carla walked in. "Oops, sorry, Mom," she said, turning away. Guess it was about time. When we rejoined the kids, Carla whispered something to Terry, and they both smiled. Angela and I kept things reserved for the rest of the evening, but I couldn't help looking forward to what would come next. The following day, while the kids were at school, Angela and I took an extended lunch break and headed back home, finally releasing all the pent-up energy. We returned to work just before closing time, but after that, long lunches became a regular thing. Angela also got more serious about house hunting. Detective Green stopped by often, mostly to chat, though he occasionally glanced at the cars. He had developed a fondness for a Studebaker Hawk once owned by Roger Adbert, and Angela had offered him a good deal on it. One day, Angela surprised me with a request. "Danny, I need you to take me to Marcy," she said. The boys and I had been visiting Marcy less frequently, but she never seemed to mind. "Is there a reason?" I asked. "Unfinished business. I need to wrap it up," she replied. I still didn't fully understand what she meant. I grasped her words, but struggled to comprehend what she was really getting at. "Do you want me to go in with you?" I offered. "Just drive me," she said. "You don't need to stay with me during the talk." It was a warm, sunny fall day when we arrived in Muni. The prisoner meetings were held outside, so I parked near the fence. 10 minutes later, Marcy and Angela came out to the courtyard and sat at a table. They started talking and smiling, almost like old friends. But after 5 minutes, the mood shifted. Marcy's smile vanished. She stood up, leaning over the table, glaring at Angela, who still looked completely calm. Suddenly, Marcy lunged across the table, trying to grab Angela. Security quickly intervened, pulling Marcy back into the building as she kicked and yelled. Angela glanced at me, smiled, and shrugged before leaving the visitor area. She was still smiling as she got back in the car. "What on earth was that all about?" I asked, bewildered. "Your ex-wife is quite the piece of work," Angela laughed. We drove a few miles in silence before she adjusted her seatbelt. I introduced myself, and at first, she seemed glad to see me. Everything was fine as long as she thought I was on her side. I raised an eyebrow. "What did you say?" "I told her I came from Baltimore to get revenge," Angela explained. "She probably assumed you meant revenge against me." "I guess," I said, intrigued. "Exactly," she continued. "But what I really meant was that I was going to get even with Tony by taking over his business. I guess you can get revenge on a dead guy, right?" I chuckled. "Sure. But what made her so mad?" Angela shrugged. She started pressing for specifics, like when and how. Obviously, she thought I was talking about you. Now I was curious. "So what did you tell her?" "I told her it would take a long time and asked if she wanted updates. She eagerly agreed, wanting every detail. But when I explained my plan, she completely lost it. She just went wild." I laughed. "That's priceless." "All right," Angela said, her smile widening. "So what's this plan to liquidate me?" "I'm all ears." I raised an eyebrow, feeling a little puzzled. "I told her I'd do it by having sex with you until you drop dead," she said nonchalantly. "That's it?" I asked, surprised. "Yep. Funny, right?" Angela grinned. I thought she'd get angry, but I didn't expect her to completely lose it. We sat in silence for a moment, both smiling. I couldn't have been prouder of how this whole situation was playing out. "So when's this attack supposed to start?" I asked, grinning. "As soon as we get to the next motel," Angela replied with a wink. 2 months later, Angela and I got married in a small backyard ceremony at our new home. Angela even sent Marcy an invitation, with a little note inside. "Everything's going according to plan. He should be